Have you ever heard of the man who made Pablo Escobar tremble? Yes, the great Escobar, before whom the world knelt, once said a sentence immortalized by history. The only man I ever feared in my life was a woman named Griselda Blanco. Before the great cartels emerged, and before Miami became a capital of blood, there was the Godmother, the Black Widow who was not content with merely killing her enemies, but killed every man who shared her bed. This is not just a story about drugs. It is a journey into the depths of the most brutal criminal mind, of a woman who shattered all the patriarchal rules of the world of organized crime and invented methods of killing that we still see in the news today. Prepare yourselves, for we are about to dig into the archives of the Cocaine Queen in a long and detailed script, where we will reveal secrets you haven't seen even in the most famous Netflix series. And before we dive into the sea of blood, if you are a fan of mysterious true stories and deep investigations, join our community now and hit the subscribe button, because here we don't just tell history, we make you live it.
On February 15, 1943, a girl was born by the name of Griselda Blanco Restrepo. There was nothing in her birth to suggest she would become the goddess of death for Florida and Colombia. She was born in Cartagena, or perhaps Santa Marta. Archives differ, but the only certainty was the black poverty that surrounded her cradle. At the age of 3, her mother, Ana Restrepo, who worked in prostitution and suffered from alcoholism, took her and they moved south to the city of Medellin. Medellin during that era was undergoing violent economic and social transformations and was a hotspot for poverty that breeds crime. There, in those alleys redolent with the scent of failure, Griselda began to absorb the laws of the street before she even learned to read. A childhood that was supposed to be full of innocence was for Griselda a school of absolute cruelty. It is said that her mother was subjected to constant beatings in front of her eyes, and some reports even indicate that Griselda herself was a victim of sexual assaults by her mother's clients and lovers. This psychological wreckage produced a being who felt neither pain nor empathy. At only 11 years old, Griselda committed a crime that shook the hearts of those who heard of it. She joined a gang of street children and kidnapped a 10-year-old boy from the upscale El Poblado neighborhood. With her innocent features, Griselda was the bait that lured the boy. When his wealthy family refused to pay the ransom, perhaps because they didn't take the threats of children seriously, Griselda did not hesitate for a moment. She placed a gun to the boy's head and fired in cold blood, ending his life and her innocence all at once. That was the first body in her long record, which would later include hundreds.
By her teenage years, Griselda had become an expert in the arts of pickpocketing and theft. To escape the hell of her mother and her abusive lover, she ran away from home at the age of 19 and lived a ghostly life in the dark streets of Medellin. She was forced to work in prostitution to secure her next meal, which made her understand the psychology of men and how their desires could be exploited for control. During this period, she met the man who would open the doors of criminal professionalism for her, Carlos Trujillo. Carlos was not just an ordinary thief. He was a professional document forger and a coyote, human smuggler, who transported illegal immigrants to the United States, in addition to his small trade in marijuana. Griselda married him while she was still a teenager and bore him 3 sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo. From Carlos, Griselda learned how documents are forged and how smuggling operations across borders are managed, but her ambition exceeded Carlos's limited intelligence. In 1964, the family moved to New York with forged identities, and there Griselda began to carve her path in the marijuana trade before discovering the white gold, cocaine. As her ambition escalated, her relationship with Carlos became strained, and it wasn't long before their marriage ended in divorce in the late 60s. In the early 70s, Carlos Trujillo was found dead. It was said that Griselda ordered his assassination due to financial disputes, thus opening her record as a Black Widow who spared no one, not even the father of her children. After getting rid of Carlos Trujillo, Griselda wasted no time in grieving. She realized that New York was the grand stage the world was waiting for. She entered into a partnership, both romantic and criminal, with Alberto Bravo, a Colombian smuggler who possessed a strong network of connections in Colombia and aspirations that went beyond human smuggling. During this period, the world was changing. Marijuana was beginning to lose its luster in favor of a fine white powder that began to invade the fashion halls and discos of New York: cocaine. While other smugglers were transporting small quantities in double-bottomed bags, Griselda thought with the mindset of an empress, not a carrier. Here, at this historic moment in criminal history, the criminal genius of Griselda Blanco emerged. She established an underwear factory in Colombia, but the goal was not to compete with fashion houses. Rather, the goal was forensic technology. Griselda ordered the manufacturing of custom bras and panties equipped with secret pockets lined with materials that prevented scent leakage and made the powder appear as part of the body's natural curves. She began hiring hundreds of women, who were called mules, to make daily flights from Bogota to New York. She knew that customs officers at that time were hesitant to search women thoroughly or intimately, and she exploited this hesitation to flood New York with tons of cocaine.
The Bravo Blanco empire began to generate profits no one had dreamed of. Millions of dollars were flowing weekly into the modest Queens apartment where she lived. But with money comes attention. In 1975, American authorities launched their first strategic attack on her in what was known as Operation Dogwood. This was the first major cocaine case in the history of the United States, where charges were brought against Griselda and 30 of her associates. With her usual intelligence, Griselda did not wait for a knock on the door. She packed her bags and fled with Alberto Bravo back to Colombia, leaving their burning New York empire behind. But the escape did not calm her spirit. Rather, it ignited the fires of suspicion in her heart. In Colombia, tension began to rise between her and Alberto. She accused him of stealing from their shared profits, while he was fed up with her desire for absolute control. On an autumn night in 1975, in a dark parking lot in Bogota, the confrontation took place that would change the balance of power in the world of cocaine forever. Griselda, who was hiding a gun in her shoe, faced Alberto and 6 of his bodyguards. The argument heated up, and in a moment of madness, Griselda pulled her gun and shot Alberto directly in the face. Alberto or his guards returned fire, and Griselda was wounded in the stomach, but Alberto and his 6 guards all ended up as dead bodies. Griselda emerged from that night wounded in body, but she had been reborn as the Iron Lady who had no partner. She had killed her second husband, annihilated his entourage, and seized all the threads of the trade for herself, proving to the world that the Godmother had arrived and that the era of the Black Widow had officially begun.
After establishing her control in Colombia and getting rid of Alberto Bravo, Griselda Blanco had no intention of retiring. Instead, she was preparing for a larger invasion. Her eyes were set on Miami, a city that in the late 70s was merely a quiet tourist resort for retirees. But beneath this calm, Griselda saw a gold mine. Miami was the natural gateway for all the cocaine coming from the south, and it was the city that would witness the transformation of the Black Widow from a mere clever smuggler into a dictator ruling with absolute terror. Griselda returned to Florida, but this time she did not enter as a stranger. She entered as a devastating hurricane that would reshape the criminal demographics of America forever.
Griselda's strategy in Miami was different from any mafia gang known in American history. She did not believe in negotiation or sharing stakes, but in the total extermination of competitors. Griselda launched what was called the Cocaine Cowboy Wars, an era during which Miami recorded the highest crime rates in the history of the United States, to the point that the medical examiner's office was forced to rent refrigerated trucks from Burger King stores to store bodies that the morgues could no longer accommodate. Griselda was not content with merely eliminating rival smugglers, whether Cuban or American. She followed a scorched earth policy. If one of her followers betrayed her or stood in her way, she would order the killing of his wife, children, and even their pets before his eyes prior to eliminating him, to entrench the idea that the Godmother's wrath knew no bounds and no one could escape it. During this period, Griselda established an army of hitmen, sicarios, who owed her absolute loyalty, not out of love for her, but out of terror of her brutality. Miami witnessed daily assassinations in broad daylight, in shopping malls, on golf courses, and even at traffic lights. The message Griselda wanted to send was that Miami is mine, and whoever wants a share must prepare for death. Thanks to this terror, competitors retreated, and Griselda became the sole controller of the flow of cocaine to the East Coast. Death money began to flow at astronomical rates, with her wealth during that era estimated at billions of dollars, enabling her to buy off police officers and politicians, turning Miami into a state within a state under the rule of the Black Widow. Miami during her reign was the laboratory in which Griselda's sick mind proved that extreme cruelty is the shortest path to absolute sovereignty, an era that later paved the way for the likes of Pablo Escobar and the Colombian cartels to enter America through the door that Griselda had forced open with the blood of her victims.
July 11, 1979 was an ordinary day in Miami until Griselda Blanco decided to turn it into a scene from a cinematic horror film. In that era, drug dealers settled their accounts in dark alleys, but Griselda wanted to send a message to the entire world that she was the only law in Florida. In broad daylight, while families were shopping, an armored truck, later known as the War Wagon, burst into the parking lot of Dadeland Mall. This truck was not loaded with goods. It was a mobile arsenal, armored on the inside with steel and equipped with gun ports, another innovation of Griselda's sick mind to ensure the efficiency of the kill.
The target was Germán Jiménez Paneso, a rival drug dealer who thought he was safe inside a liquor store. Two of Griselda's hired hitmen, cut out in civilian clothes, entered the store calmly and then, in a matter of seconds, pulled out Ingram MAC-10 submachine guns and showered Paneso and his guard with a hail of bullets that left them no chance to breathe. It was not just an assassination, it was a massacre. Hundreds of shots were fired in less than a minute, turning the store into a pool of blood and shattered glass. The bullets didn't just hit the targets, they pierced the walls and nearly hit dozens of innocent shoppers who fled in a state of mass panic never before seen in Miami.
This operation was the peak of arrogance for Griselda Blanco, but it was also the beginning of her end. Before the Dataland massacre, federal authorities treated drug crimes as local criminal cases. But after this bloody display in a famous shopping center, the American government realized that Miami had become an out-of-control war zone. The blood spilled at Dataland was what forced the U.S. President and Congress to take immediate action. As a result of this incident, the legendary CENTAC 26 was formed, a joint task force between the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the Miami Police, allocated huge budgets and massive intelligence resources with one goal: to catch the Black Widow and dismantle her empire. Griselda had made herself public enemy number one, and the largest manhunt in the history of organized crime in Florida officially began, where the question was no longer, will she be arrested, but when and how.
While the streets of Miami were drowning in blood due to her orders, Griselda Blanco lived in a parallel world of extravagant luxury and megalomania. Griselda did not see herself as just an ordinary drug dealer. She considered herself an epic figure from mafia legends. Her obsession with the film The Godfather reached a pathological level. She identified with the character of Vito Corleone and saw in his story a reflection of her rise from the bottom to the top. This obsession didn't stop at watching. It was manifested in the deepest details of her private life. When she gave birth to her fourth son from her third husband, Dario Sepulveda, she did not choose a traditional Colombian name for him, but called him Michael Corleone Blanco, named after Michael Corleone, the son who inherited the Godfather's empire in the movie. This naming was an official declaration that Griselda was not just building a gang, but establishing a criminal royal dynasty that would prevail for decades.
Griselda's life inside her fortified palaces in Miami was a mixture of extreme luxury and sadism. Reports indicate that her wealth during that era pumped astronomical sums, reaching $80 million per month, allowing her to buy anything that came to mind. She owned packs of fierce German shepherds, which she gave names related to crime, and she took pride in owning rare furniture and antiques that once belonged to historical emperors and leaders. In her legendary parties, it wasn't just wine and drugs that prevailed, but terror was the constant guest. Griselda enjoyed humiliating her guests and followers, sometimes forcing them to engage in degrading practices at gunpoint just to feel her absolute power over their souls. Griselda was a woman who devoured power, And as her wealth increased, her disconnection from reality grew, and she turned into a sadistic personality who found pleasure in controlling the fates of others.
As for her first three sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo, their story was the true embodiment of the tragedy of living in the shadow of the Black Widow. Instead of receiving an education or a normal life, these children grew up watching tons of cocaine being packed before their eyes and hearing murder orders being issued just as dinner orders were issued. The three sons became involved in their mother's criminal activities from their teenage years and became princes in the empire of death, supervising distribution and assassination operations. Griselda loved her sons in a suffocatingly possessive way, but this love was what led them to their deaths in the end. Almost all of them faced bloody ends as a result of the conflicts created by their mother, causing her to live to see the collapse of the dynasty she tried to build with blood. Griselda was both a mother and a godmother at the same time, managing her family and her business with a heart of stone, believing that loyalty is not bought except through fear, and that love is a point of weakness that has no place in the Corleone world she made for herself in Miami.
If Griselda Blanco had killed her first husband, Carlos Trujillo, for power, and her second husband, Alberto Bravo, to defend her empire, then her killing of her third husband, Dario Sepulveda, was the ultimate embodiment of her pathological desire for possession. The relationship with Dario began in the late 70s. Dario was initially part of her security apparatus, a hitman who possessed handsomeness and strength, which attracted Griselda to him. They married in 1978, and this marriage resulted in her pampered son, Michael Corleone, whom Griselda saw as a legitimate heir to the throne of death. But behind the gilded palace doors in Miami, the relationship was eroding due to the megalomania and murderous jealousy that Griselda harbored for everyone around her. Dario, who began to feel danger to his life and the future of his son, decided in 1983 to do what no one had dared to do, to flee the grip of the Black Widow.
Dario's escape was not ordinary. He took the child Michael Corleone with him and returned to Colombia, hoping his country would provide him protection from his wife's wrath. For Griselda, this was not just marital betrayal, but the theft of her most precious possession. Griselda did not cry, nor did she lament her luck. Instead, she did what she excelled at. She issued an assassination order. Griselda sent a team of sicarios, hitmen, loyal to her, to Medellín, with clear instructions: kill Dario and bring my son back to me alive. The operation was carried out in Griselda's specific style. The killers disguised themselves as police officers and intercepted Dario's car in broad daylight. In front of the eyes of the child Michael, who was only 5 years old at the time, treacherous bullets were emptied into his father's body, who fell dead over the steering wheel, drenched in his blood, which splattered onto his child's clothes.
Following the incident, the child, Michael Corleone, returned to Miami to find his mother waiting for him with a chilling coldness, as if nothing had happened. This incident didn't just end Dario's life, but it ended any doubt the world had that Griselda Blanco had stripped herself of every shred of humanity. For someone who kills the father of her children in front of her child's eyes cannot know the meaning of mercy. The title of Black Widow became attached to her more than ever before, not just because she kills her husbands, but because she does so with a coldness and organization that exceeds description. Her message to all the men in her life was clear: I am the owner, and I am the commander, and whoever tries to leave my orbit, the bullet is his only answer. After this incident, Griselda lived in a golden isolation, surrounded by fear on all sides, managing her empire with a hand stained with the blood of the people closest to her, turning her family life into a massive graveyard for everyone she loved or who loved her.
By 1980, Griselda Blanco was no longer just a successful drug smuggler, but had turned into a criminal economic phenomenon unprecedented in the history of the United States. She managed a financial state with Miami as its capital and borders extending from the Andes Mountains to the streets of New York. In this era, the revenues of Griselda's empire reached astronomical figures, as she was earning an estimated $80 million per month.
This amount was not just a number, but meant that Griselda Blanco was the richest woman in the world of crime, and perhaps one of the richest women in the entire world at that time. Money was flowing faster than the ability of banks to absorb it, which forced her to own secret counting houses where employees spent their days weighing stacks of money on scales instead of counting them, because time didn't allow for calculating every single dollar.
This extravagant wealth was reflected in her lifestyle, which was characterized by provocative luxury and megalomania. Griselda bought real estate and luxury palaces in the most prestigious neighborhoods of Miami. Her homes were like fortified museums. The furniture was plated with pure gold. Rare paintings covered the walls, and antiques dating back to the eras of emperors filled the corners. She owned a private plane to transport her family and followers, and a fleet of luxury cars that she never drove, but used as manifestations of power. Among her most famous whims was that she owned a set of household utensils made of gold, said to have belonged to the British royal family or major historical figures, which she bought at secret auctions for astronomical prices, just to say that she was the godmother who eats from the plates of kings.
But luxury for Griselda was always wrapped in fear and brutality. She trusted no one, so she surrounded herself with an army of guards and German shepherds trained for military-style killing. She named one of them Hitler, and this favorite dog of hers accompanied her in her meetings to intimidate her opponents. Griselda spent millions of dollars on the debauched parties she held in her palaces, where she distributed drugs as if they were candy, and forced her guests to engage in degrading practices to prove her dominance over them. In her world, money was the only way to buy silence and loyalty, and she used it intelligently to recruit informants and buy off low-level employees at airports and ports, making her empire impenetrable for long years. Griselda in her peak was a living embodiment of the ugly face of the American dream, the woman who turned the powder of death into mountains of gold, and lived in a golden cage she built from the skulls of her enemies and friends alike, believing that money is the only god worthy of worship in the blood-stained streets of Miami. In the world of organized crime, power does not lie merely in possessing the commodity, but in the ability to deliver it to the heart of the enemy's market without detection. Here, the dark logistical genius of Griselda Blanco was manifested. While traditional smugglers relied on luck or simple bribes, Griselda turned smuggling into a precise science that combined manual industry and complex military operations. At the peak of her activity, Griselda was supervising the shipping of approximately 3,400 pounds of cocaine per month to the United States, a figure no one had dared to reach in that era. These quantities did not pass through traditional routes, but through the death fleet that Griselda designed to be invisible to radar devices and the eyes of informants.
The most famous and influential innovation in her career was her exploitation of human weaknesses among law enforcement. Griselda established a specialized underwear factory in Colombia, but it was in fact a laboratory for forensic engineering, where seamstresses were trained to manufacture bras and panties lined with secret pockets accurately designed to fit the contours of the female body. She employed hundreds of women who appeared to be ordinary travelers or mothers and pushed them to board planes destined for New York and Miami while carrying kilograms of cocaine hidden inside their underwear. She realized that customs officers in the 70s and 80s would feel embarrassed to conduct a thorough physical search of a woman who appeared dignified, and with this simple and clever trick, she flooded American streets with the powder of death for years without being caught.
Her logistical ambition did not stop at human mules, but extended to include sea and air. Griselda was among the first to use go-fast boats that set off from the coasts of Colombia to meet large cargo ships in the open sea, or unload their cargo in the Bahamas before transporting it in small planes to secret runways in the swamps of Florida. She owned a network of private runways and suicide pilots who flew at very low altitudes to avoid American radar. Thanks to this complex logistical network, Griselda was earning astronomical profits, reaching $80 million per month, which enabled her to buy the latest eavesdropping and communication devices to monitor police movements before they moved toward her. Griselda preceded the minds of the Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) by decades and turned the smuggling process from an individual adventure into a massive industrial machine that never stopped turning, making her capture require a whole army and a comprehensive change in American border control laws. After a decade that Griselda Blanco spent manipulating the most powerful security apparatuses in the world, and after turning Miami into a pool of blood, the Godmother felt the noose beginning to tighten around her in Florida. In 1984, Griselda decided to take a tactical step to disappear from sight. She left her empire in Miami under the management of her assistants and moved to Irvine in California, thinking that the calm of the suburbs would protect her from the eyes of the DEA. She lived there under an alias, surrounded by her children and the remains of her fortune, practicing her life as an ordinary mother during the day while managing her operations via telephone at night. But what Griselda didn't know was that federal agent Bob Palumbo had made her case a personal vendetta. He had spent years tracking her trail, gathering threads from New York to Colombia, down to every shipment that entered Miami.
On the morning of February 17, 1985, the federal unit received the green light for the raid. Agents stormed the house in a lightning moment, expecting a violent armed confrontation with the Godmother's legendary guards, but they found a scene no one expected. Griselda Blanco was lying on her bed in the bedroom, and instead of a gold pistol or a MAC-10 submachine gun, she was holding the Holy Bible and reading it with intense focus. When Agent Palumbo entered, she looked at him with a chilling calm, and when he asked about her identity, she tried to use an alias with a confident accent, but Palumbo approached her and printed a kiss on her cheek in a symbolic move inspired by mafia films, and said to her, "The game is over, Griselda."
Griselda was taken into custody, and the charges against her were enough to send a whole army to prison for life: conspiracy to smuggle and distribute cocaine, human trafficking, and document forgery. Although she was the moving hand behind hundreds of murders in Miami, the public prosecution initially focused on drug cases to ensure she remained behind bars. At that moment, the world thought the legend of the Black Widow had ended and that she would spend the remainder of her life in a narrow cell. But Griselda, even behind bars, still had cards to play and a mind that never stopped planning to escape the hangman's noose that began to approach her neck.
Griselda Blanco was facing the most dangerous challenge of her life, for after her conviction in drug cases in California, Miami authorities brought 3 first-degree murder charges against her, charges that certainly meant the electric chair in the state of Florida. The strongest evidence against her was the testimony of Jorge Ayala, her right hand and executor of her most difficult operations, who decided to turn on her to become the star witness. Rivi knew all the secrets. He knew where the bodies were buried, who gave the orders, and how Griselda enjoyed planning the massacres. It seemed that Griselda's survival this time was impossible, and that the Black Widow had finally fallen into the trap she set for herself.
However, in a dramatic turn that only happens in fictional novels, the scandal broke that saved Griselda's life. Investigators discovered that the main witness, Rivi Ayala, was conducting scandalous sexual phone calls from inside the prison with secretaries and employees in the Miami State Attorney's Office. It wasn't just calls, but telephone relationships that Rivi exploited to manipulate the employees and obtain privileges. Worse still, these calls were recorded and leaked. This moral scandal completely destroyed Ayala's credibility as a witness before the judiciary and made it impossible for the prosecution to use him in a case whose punishment was death for fear of challenging all the trial proceedings. Griselda's lawyer, Dominique Bob, exploited this loophole with rare legal brilliance and pressured the prosecution, which was in a state of pathetic embarrassment. As a result, the prosecution was forced to strike a deal with the devil. Griselda agreed to plead guilty to 3 counts of murder in exchange for a sentence of only 20 years, to be served concurrently with her previous drug sentences. Instead of death by electric chair, Griselda found herself on her way out of prison after a few years, thanks to a sex scandal she had no hand in, but which served her as if it were a demonic miracle. The Godmother had escaped death once again, proving that even in her weakest state, fate, or dark luck, remains standing by her side to protect the legacy of the Black Widow from an absolute end. Prison for Griselda Blanco was not the end of the road, but was merely a new office for managing her operations. She entered prison possessing millions of dollars hidden in secret accounts, which enabled her to buy loyalties even inside the prison walls.
Griselda completely rejected the idea of spending the rest of her life behind bars, so she began weaving the strangest and most dangerous conspiracy in the history of political and criminal crime, a plot to kidnap John F. Kennedy Jr. Griselda realized that the Kennedy family was like the royal family in America, and that kidnapping the son of the beloved late president would shake the foundations of the White House and force the American government to yield to her demands in exchange for his safety.
The plot was not just a passing idea, but was a complex logistical operation supervised by Griselda from inside her prison via intermediaries and hired killers outside the walls. The plan was to kidnap John F. Kennedy Jr. in New York City, move him to an unknown location, and then begin bargaining with federal authorities. My freedom in exchange for his life. Griselda spent huge sums to fund surveillance and gather information about Kennedy's movements, but as usual in Griselda's life full of betrayal, the information was leaked. U.S. intelligence agencies and the FBI were able to intercept her communications and discover the plot before its execution, which led to tightening the guard on her and moving her to a more isolated cell. This incident proved to the world that Griselda Blanco, even while bound in shackles, remains the most dangerous woman who never stops thinking about challenging the entire state for her freedom and power.
While Griselda was trying to orchestrate her escape plans from prison, the blood curse she planted in the streets of Miami and Colombia began to harvest her most precious possessions, her sons. Her first 3 sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo, who grew up in the embrace of cocaine and assassination orders, became easy targets for her mother's many enemies who were waiting for her moment of weakness. In the world of cartels, revenge does not expire, and since reaching Griselda inside the American prison was difficult, taking revenge on her sons in the streets of Colombia was the preferred option for competitors who had tasted the woes of the Black Widow's oppression.
The criminal world received successive news about the fall of the cocaine princes. Osvaldo was killed in a nightclub, followed by Uber in a liquidation operation related to a drug deal, and it wasn't long until Dixon met his end in the same bloody way. Griselda received news of the killing of her sons while she was behind bars, unable to do anything except issue retaliatory orders that no longer found anyone to execute them with the same previous force. Psychological analysts believe that the death of her sons was the true divine punishment for Griselda. She, who did not cry for her victims, found herself losing her legacy for which she sacrificed everything. Nothing remained of her lineage except her youngest son, Michael Corleone, who lived his life hunted, trying to stay alive in a world that saw nothing in him but the son of the woman who burned everyone. Griselda turned from a crowned queen into a grieving mother, watching from her cell the collapse of the empire and the family together, realizing in the end that the Black Widow does not kill her husbands only, but her venom has reached even the fruits of her womb.
In 2004, after spending nearly 19 years behind bars in the United States, Griselda Blanco was finally released due to her deteriorating health and was immediately deported to Colombia. Griselda was no longer that woman full of vitality and evil who used to shake the foundations of Miami. Prison had taken its toll on her body, but it hadn't taken its toll on her eyes, which still carried the look of the godmother who had seen everything. She returned to Medellín, the city that witnessed her first crimes as a child, but she found it a completely different city. Pablo Escobar had been killed, the major cartels had fragmented, and the streets she used to rule with blood were now under the control of a new generation that didn't know much about the Black Widow.
Griselda settled in one of the upscale neighborhoods in Medellin and tried to live as a ghost. She realized that her life was hanging by a thread, for in Colombia, debts do not expire, and it is a city of thousands of lives. Griselda tried to paint a new image of herself. Rumors spread that she had become a born-again Christian and that she spent her time in prayer and asking forgiveness for past sins. She lived in isolation, accompanied only by her son Michael Corleone and a few bodyguards who remained loyal to her old memory. But in the world of the mafia, calm is only a prelude to the storm, and Griselda knew better than anyone else that criminal justice might end in prison, but street justice does not end except with blood. Griselda Blanco lived 8 years in Medellin, as if she were living in stoppage time from life. She would sometimes go out shopping like any ordinary elderly woman, buying meat and vegetables and dealing politely with her neighbors, who, for the most part, didn't realize that this quiet old woman was the cocaine queen who flooded an entire continent with poisons. Griselda believed she had succeeded in disappearing within the crowd, and that her old enemies had either died or forgotten about her. But the truth was the opposite. For in the halls of organized crime in Colombia, Griselda's story was still told as a lesson in cruelty and betrayal. And there was a new generation of sicarios who saw in her head a grand prize for settling accounts dating back decades.
During these years, Griselda tried to maintain her remaining wealth away from the eyes of the authorities and managed some real estate that had not been confiscated. Despite her attempt to stay away from the limelight, the prestige of evil was pursuing her. She was always mentioned in documentaries and books that talked about the history of drugs, which renewed the desire for revenge among the families of her victims. Griselda lived in a prison of another kind, a prison of fear of every motorcycle that approached, and of every stranger who looked at her for a long time. She realized that the Black Widow had killed many men, and that the patriarchal criminal society she once challenged would not let her die in peace in her bed.
On September 3, 2012, fate put a final chapter to Griselda Blanco's life, characterized by amazing poetic justice. While the godmother, age 69, was leaving a Cardizo butcher shop in the Belén neighborhood of Medellin, an unidentified hitman on a motorcycle approached her. In cold blood, and in a style that was a carbon copy of the style invented by Griselda's own mind decades earlier, the killer fired 2 fatal bullets at her head from close range. Griselda fell dead instantly, and her blood splattered on the sidewalk next to the bags of meat she was carrying, in a scene that summarized her life, which she spent turning humans into meat of no value. Griselda Blanco died by the same weapon she brandished in the face of the world. She died by the death motorcycle that she made a symbol of terror in Miami. The Black Widow departed and left behind a black legacy of crime and logistical and combat innovations that cartels still use today. Griselda was a stark reminder that violence is a closed circle that always returns to swallow its creator.
Griselda Blanco's journey has ended, but its traces are still carved in the streets of Miami and Medellin. She was a woman who ruled an empire of death, and her life ended with a bullet from an unknown person on a motorcycle. Do you believe this end was just? Or was Griselda a victim of a criminal society that showed her no mercy when she was a child? Share your views with us in the comments. And if you liked this detailed historical investigation, do not forget to support us by liking and subscribing to the channel, so we can continue revealing the secret files of the most dangerous figures in history. I am the Investigator. I will see you in the next file, where the truth is always stranger than fiction.